Just a quick warning, this video is going to get kind of nerdy, so if that's not really your thing, well, maybe stay and listen anyway for just a change of pace. Sit back and relax, grab yourself some hot chocolate or something, treat yourself a little. I'll take care of you. Well, maybe. Anyway, just try to enjoy. But first, you're probably a fairly interesting person for even clicking on this. And no, I'm not trying to butter you up. You could be out socializing right now, getting drunk, talking about absolutely trivial bullshit. I was kind of forced to listen to some conversations from various people over the last few weeks, and it pretty much only consisted of gossip, fake drama, and current events. To be honest, I don't think I'm that smart, but I'm just introverted, that's all. But people think I already don't have to hear everyone else spewing about nonsense all day, every day, especially politics. I know it's important, but when you're at the butt of it, it's not really useful to complain about it repeatedly unless you're an activist of some kind. Especially since people you're talking to are probably similar on the political spectrum. People you disagree with just distance themselves anyway. I'm not exactly a persuasive person or a socialite anyway, so I just compartmentalize that for the most part. Then, of course, there's talk of sports, which I don't really care about. I've actually never sat through a full broadcast of any sporting event ever, though I've played plenty of sports most of my life, and I still exercise regularly. But the most patience I can muster towards sports is maybe a 1-minute clip of a world record from an Olympic event or something. Every conversation with sports always ends up with, so what was the score? Oh, that's what it was? Alright, cool. And then there's really nothing to add to it. But it really is totally uninteresting to me. And I used to try really hard to care about it, but not anymore. That's just me. So if you're trying to build relationships, it's all important, but I find it incredibly exhausting. And at the end of the day, I'd ask myself if any of it felt productive whatsoever. And the answer was always a resounding no. But if I had to give you one piece of advice before you get too uninterested in all of this, I'd say just get rid of all your social media. Just cold turkey it, delete it all. It's worse than cancer. At least cancer will eventually end you. Social media will keep you hooked, drain your energy, and you'll still be alive, just feeling depleted and miserable. I'll be completely transparent. I probably wouldn't even be alive today if I hadn't given up that crap years ago. So you're comparing people at their illusory best to your subconscious worst. If there's one thing I can assure you of in this video, let it just be that. It's all bullshit. Just ignore it. I'm so disconnected from 99% of people, and it feels fan-fucking-tastic. You go from absolutely miserable to peacefully miserable. Still better. So read a damn book, I beg you. Just force yourself to do it. And don't be one of those snobs that puts it down when the first 2 sentences aren't perfect. I promise you that there are hidden gems with very slow introductions, and even halfway through. But if you treat it more like putting a puzzle together, you'll appreciate it a lot more. You're gonna have to be patient, but yeah, at least read the back and see what it's all about. But I'm not that picky. If someone says it's well written and it's cheap or free, I'll probably read it even if the first few chapters are boring. Well, except for certain themes like autobiographies, those are kind of boring. But if you have any recommendations, hell, even if it's cheesy female erotica, I'll take a peek at it. Why not? Probably not, but I've already got a lot on my plate, but I can add some more, even if it is spicy. So you won't regret reading once you do find the right book, and it takes you to the right place of interest, and expounds upon that interest. I've never regretted reading a single book that I picked up for myself, not in my entire life. But I've definitely regretted 80% or more of the time I spent in situations, or at events throughout my life. So experience tells me that reading is always better. I know everyone thinks movies and TV series are preferable, and sometimes that's true, yeah, but there's certain books that are better reading and left to the imagination, because the world building is just better that way. Or it's so abstract that by putting it into illustration, it's just severely diminished. Or it's educational or philosophical, and it requires reading and rereading, and it absolutely can only be read. So of all the books I've read recently, I'd argue that they're all superior in book form. And a couple I'll mention here were audiobooks, I admit it, but it works when the book isn't so serious. There's a few books I took in through audio in the past, and they were completely ruined. So one example was Blood Meridian. It's seriously diminished when you hear it, rather than being able to read certain striking words. Certain lines just punch you in the face, and they force you to read them again, or to pause and take a moment to really reflect on them. And by the way, I do watch a lot of shows, so if I had to recommend just one show to watch, go watch From. Just one word, From. It's on MGM, and pace yourself nice and slow, and pay very careful attention to the details in that show, and you won't know what the hell you're getting into. So the slower you watch it, the more theories you can build. It's pretty interesting. And it would have been nice to watch that with someone else, since it is that kind of show, but it's fine. There's still tons of stuff to read also. All in all, books are probably the best distraction available today, which is kind of sad, because people are reading less than ever. So part of my channel is going to be aimed at possibly working on short stories and telling them, or making my video scripts build on parables or creative writing. So I think the next few generations of people are really going to have a difficult time reading, especially from classic literature, and they're just going to turn into these sort of bonobos that can only learn by looking at pictures with 4 words of text each. So I think using symbolism and creative writing can keep things fairly simple while still turning the gears in people's minds. I don't think people are stupider now. I just think they're not at their full capacity. There's a lot wasted here, and it's really sad to see. So in my books, I like to include at least one bit of academia and try to convince myself I'm not falling into a complete mind-rotted state. So the books I have are enough to keep my brain engaged, even if they're less educational and more for entertainment, but it's mostly for distracting. And that's just kind of the entire point overall. I like a book to be immersive and then make me feel like I'm empty inside by the time I finish it. Really good books will sink this sort of a hook into your heart and tear a chunk of it away when you're done with it. That's just the nature of attachment. But I can just move on to other books without having to mourn for too many particular stories. So before I get into what I read in January, I decided to tackle the first book in Schopenhauer's World of Will and Representation, and I did it for the first time while I was at work over the weekend. This one was a bit heavier, but I do have some questions for any Schopenhauer experts if you're listening. Before I finish it, I was going to reach out and ask if anyone here is well read on it, or just a fellow critic, maybe into science and philosophy. So he basically takes Kant's transcendental idealism, polishes it up, and he fixes it, or at least he assumes he fixes several elements, like replacing the requirements of substance, for example, from time to space. So while Kant can justify later scientific discoveries, like bent space and relativity, Schopenhauer's version of reality seems more tenuous, especially when it comes to non-Euclidean geometry. So my question is, how would Schopenhauer reconcile modern-day physics into his worldview here? Would he just call the fabric of space-time the representation itself? I'd really love for someone to illustrate it for me. If they could, of course. Sort of how his philosophy might look in regard to space-time and gravity. I also understand that Darwin's evolution was coming around at the time that Schopenhauer got older, basically after the book was published, and it wasn't edited very much. But he basically says causality is evolution as simply a linear chain. And I wrote here that Schopenhauer dismissed Lamarckism and has possible scientific inconsistency with evolution. Mutation and speciation are just representations of the will. But this is just unfalsifiable. Empiricism built evolution. Therefore, compartmentalize science with epistemology as required. I just wonder how Schopenhauer at his best would reckon with evolution today, and how that would fit in with his model. So after reading just this first book, I'll continue, but now I'm interested in reading more from an empiricist's view. So I'll probably just end up picking something from David Hume, as much as I don't like him. But I'm also still in disbelief for objectivity arising first in any worldview. I like his representation being a mediator. Still, it was really cool to see I had a lot of similar ideas. And I'm not saying that I'm original, but there are some shared conclusions from what I read, like possible duality. He also believed in an absolution beyond objectivity and subjectivity, but it was only possible to reach it through what he called reason intuition, which he basically thought those who could acquire it as quote-unquote humbug. Kind of funny, actually. German humor, I guess. Also, he was surprisingly kind to Stoicism, and I felt sort of a close brotherhood to Schopenhauer in some of his passages. The only thing mightier than his epistemology here was his clear insight on the human condition. For example, his quote on Antisthenes, "We must procure either understanding or a rope." But yeah, that actually did kind of make me chuckle, but I've got this sort of morbid humor. But on that note, for anyone who actually feels that way, let me just add what I wrote here. Based Stoicism, however, the rope can be fetched immediately, understanding must be built. Therefore, quick results should require careful consideration, and considerable understanding should require careful results. So for anyone feeling like doing something which can't be taken back, I do urge you to strongly reconsider. And I'll get back to Schopenhauer and Stoicism another date though. This video is just going to be far too long. So the first book, or books I read last month, was a couple volumes from Tales of Dying Earth. It contains heavily antiquated language, but has a stunning sort of brightly Boscaresque world. It's very mystical storytelling in the first volume, and then it becomes more about appreciating the world building later. I wouldn't really recommend it since it's difficult, esoteric, and old school, but if you like fantasy with subtle sci-fi elements, this might make you rethink things. It's very much built for language nerds, so it can be a struggle to digest all the stories really quickly. This is more of a book where if you really had to seek it out, then it's probably for you. If you enjoy complex world building with more modern prose, I'd recommend something like the Quantum Thief series by Hannu Rajaniemi. Maybe it's a gross comparison, but it's like a neuromancer sci-fi on steroids. But I'd suggest starting with something more like the John Carter of Mars series, which is old school. Or even something darker, grittier, post-apocalyptic, easy to read and finish quickly, although admittedly cheesy at times. You could try anything from the Deathland series from James Axler. The latter series isn't written expertly or cohesively, and that's just because there's several writers involved, and there's a lot of discontinuity, but they make for some really decently immersive world building. I give the latter series here a special mention, because it has my favorite character ever written in any book, and he goes by Dr. Theophilus Tanner. So imagine you took a brilliant English professor, kidnapped him, sent him through a time machine, it scrambles his mind, and then you just threw him in a world like Mad Max with mutant creatures, including vampires. And he talks to everyone like they're well-educated university students. He's so out of touch. All that while having mental breakdowns regularly. So I could read literally any book if they just threw his character in at any point, even just to drop a single line. He constantly uses dark humor and wit. And one of my favorite lines he says is, "Besides all that, Mrs. Kennedy, how was the car ride?" Of course, no one gets it, but anyway, maybe more German humor. But anyway, I enjoyed both volumes from Tales of the Dying Earth, and I'm going to finish the other volume soon. There's a really odd and absurd sense of humor I can't put my finger on that other books just don't have. It's probably just because it's old school. It's almost like watching two highly esteemed British gentlemen having magical fights while using vulgar words. Reading the two volumes was like dancing around the subject so you see it from multiple angles. And you have to come to the conclusion yourself of what's going on. There's an epiphany once you realize something, and you feel proud when you think you figured something out. For example, there's a described scintillant dagger, and it could be an allusion to a flashlight of some kind. Or there's an elevator, and that was described as opposite were two doors, laden with the sense of much use. Giles strode quickly across the room, but was unable to discern the means for opening the door, for it bore no latch, key, handle, knob, or bar. He rapped with his knuckles and waited. No sound returned. So you have to come to the understanding yourself. Things directly told to you don't really have the same value. But there's also some philosophical value in these books if you pay attention. The story with Guy Sphere is cursed with a burden of having a deeply inquisitive mind. He always has to know more. And he vexes his father so greatly until he asks one final question, where he can find all the roots of his knowledge. And it's a lonely journey and very uncomfortable, but the truth always seems to be a lonely and sad journey. Also, there's quite a bit of gobbledygook writing mixed with some humor, so just don't take it too seriously. For example here, there's nothing to be understood in this passage, except that your protagonist has eaten a magical bug and pissed off a time magician. Jack Vance isn't even writing purple prose at this point. It's more like ultraviolet prose. But if you intend to read anything by this guy, you're going to need at least one dictionary. And while we're on the subject of small to large world building through first-person narratives, I bring you to Shadow of the Torturer from the Book of the New Sun series by Gene Wolfe. This too has very complex ideas, but brilliant setup, probably the best written, subtle, and impactful prose I've ever read actually, and masterful use of illusions. This book, like Jack Vance's work, requires you to think as you read. You're putting together a puzzle. Wolfe has created a carefully crafted narrative where we have to deal with an unreliable narrator. So we have a young man named Severian who begins his journey as learning to become a torturer, almost like a trade school that he's been adopted in. And all the boys in this vocation are brought up as orphans, easily molded, and they're trained to be emotionally dismissal. It's just their job in the kingdom to carry out the written method of torture by the order of the autarch. There's several points where he retains his human side while apprenticing, like secretly saving and caring for a dying dog. Then he meets a woman condemned to torture, possibly to death, and he grows close to her through books. They share this thirst for knowledge for their old Earth. On her final day, which would require excruciating pain, he gives her grace by slipping a knife in her cell and letting her take her own life instead, which of course is forbidden for him. So for this, he's cast out and sent to the outskirts of a city, where his professionalism is still required. And as we learn more about the world around Severian, we begin to question not only him and others, but what exactly the world is as he describes it. We find inconsistencies in his storytelling. For example, he ardently states that he has a perfect memory, many times, but if you're paying attention to what happens, you'll see either that this is not the case, or his definition of a perfect memory is unlike ours. And how could that be done in a world of fantasy? So you'll be asking questions. By the time you finish the book, you'll question whether this was a fantasy novel, a sci-fi novel, a simulation, or a combination of them. You'll need to pay real careful attention, and you'll understand why this novel must be read and not listened to, and why it would be impossible to adapt it into a show or a movie. Wolfe is a master of using language perfectly to simultaneously deceive and convey to the reader what's really going on. So, one of my favorite descriptions was Severian learning of a book in a library that could contain more books than the entirety of the books in that entire library. And it was a vast library, so you wonder, how is this possible? So this was a wonderful book, and a truly hidden gem, I think. And I'll be reading the next two books if I can find them on sale. For certain, it's not for everyone, but at the same time, I see the work he's produced, and I feel an intense shame, honestly, that not every adult will read this. But there's also a sense of pride in reading something largely unknown. As a cool aside, Gene Wolfe was partially responsible for creating the shape of the Pringle that we know of today. And that's just due to his previous career. He kind of looks like the Pringle guy too. Take a look. Now, to be fair with these next two, I had a few leftover audiobook tokens to use, and they seem most appropriate here since I knew they would contain a lot of dialogue. And I'm also in certain situations where I'm only able to take in books while I'm doing something else, like exercising or driving. So first, we have Echopraxia by Peter Watts. And it's the successor to Blindside, but you don't have to read that to get into this. That has an interesting take on modern vampires and how that could be biologically even possible, thrown into a sci-fi scenario. This book's core idea is that God is a program in our simulation, a bug in the software which breaks physics. God is a virus. Echopraxia explores digital physics, where matter is hardware, physics is software, and time and math is an illusion. Or reality is a hologram and we're just projections, interference patterns. If God is a bug in the program, then perhaps the program is running incorrectly. The program is a false reality. And if this program is a false reality, we're not even supposed to exist. We're consequences of a glitch breaking the system. Our own existence is extremely tenuous. For every reality that exists, it shouldn't contain life or anything like this. We're the derivative of a bug system, just children of a virus. Of course, everything we do seems natural and normal, but we're just conscious to assume that. Perhaps the non-existence and non-life is the general rule for reality, and we've broken it. Of course, we can ask what the odds are. No matter how small we are, we're the conscious ones to express that dilemma. So while saying that, well, we're just unlucky to be the unconscious ones, or the conscious ones. Inversely, non-existent beings cannot express the satisfaction of their luck, or bad luck. So, of course, we have a survivor bias. And this is another reason why I think intelligent life, even life outside of our universe, they may have a much lower chance of existing whatsoever. Remember, everything we have stems from one form of life, RNA, then DNA, and there's no other life molecules. So apparently we have the conditions to do it just once, but not once since then. So yes, I'm even pessimistic about alien life, but that's a good thing, I think. Less suffering overall. So in the book, it's a virus that can improve our biology against our will, and it mocks us that we might decline and upgrade to our bodies. Why would humanity fight against something that would improve our functions? It would enslave us, but end our loneliness. It even speaks to us, do not test the Lord thy God. That's what it says to him. So it's as if God hacks our brains. It gives us scripts. It makes us more intelligent. And lastly, in the endnotes, there's some cool tidbits to learn. For example, believers in God, more so than non-believers, are better at visual pattern recognition. Also, statistically, religious people come to their beliefs through emotion, more so than their counterparts. We also see evolution backwards. We think that animals adapt to their environment, and they pass on their genes if they survive. However, it's more like their environment adapts, and if they happen to be around as that happens, they can reproduce. He also talks about the memory used in conscious beings. For example, fruit flies purposely become forgetful to save energy. Imagine if we could do that. It's pretty cool, right? His writing really reminds me of the book Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, if you have biology interests. On another book by Peter Watts, Starfish, it's more about character development. And it's more of a gritty book with plenty of humor for entertainment, sort of a mixture. But there's an interesting idea that takes a while to build up to a crescendo. It really wasn't my favorite listen, and I was expecting something else, and just felt like it had too much dialogue. It was written in his earlier years, so it wasn't nearly as good as Echopraxia and Blindsight. But if you're into artificial intelligence and how that may arise, this is a pretty good one. It takes place underwater where strange things start to occur to our characters. And it explores the emergence of intelligence and consciousness, and who or what controls the brain in an organism. The title Starfish is about the democracy of its limbs, and how it makes decisions. Even though we're using scientific terms in this book, it does feel slightly outdated in terms of AI systems. Although I believe most people would find this book enjoyable, I wouldn't highly recommend it. I'd say there's hundreds of other books probably more worth your time. But I gave you the rough idea here, so do what you want. The next book I read was The Underground Man by Dostoevsky, and this was on my must-read list. I figured at some point while reading philosophy I'd get around to this one. And why not sooner than later, right? So I came in slightly biased, knowing his views beforehand, but I was still very impressed. I really was. So word for word, line by line, this might be the most concise and poignant book I've ever read. The book It's like putting you in a boxing ring, and every sentence is a heavy punch. It really delivers. Often, some passages struck me with such force that I had to go back and continue the other books in between. Everything written here was ominously accurate and disturbingly familiar. The craziest part is how well this is aged. And this feels like one of the most timeless novels ever written, actually. It was written over 150 years ago. By the end of the book, we can believe that we don't have to live like the underground man. I understand that Dostoevsky believed beauty should be replaced instead of nihilism, or that it works in tandem with it. We can choose our own fate, and it can be beauty. I have my own take on beauty, and I find it very important despite being deeply pessimistic. It's going to be a very long project to do a video just on that, and I want to treat the subject delicately. So if I'm forced to hold one thing sacred, let it be that. You might be surprised what I have to say about it, but I think it fits my pessimistic and dualistic worldview comfortably, even so far as to aligning with my approach to nothingness and meaninglessness. But enough of that. So, I respect his writing very much, and I've got Crime and Punishment coming up next, even though I already know what that's about. I respect well-written books, regardless of the topic, and it would be a shame if I never read it. It's not that his books are really good, it's just that they're must-reads. You sort of have an obligation to read anything by Dostoevsky, but I could say that about a lot of others. Breaking away from philosophy once again, we go back to the world of fantasy and a possible future Earth. Speaking of Mr. Tchaikovsky earlier, the final book I read was Cage of Souls. The Cage of Souls refers to the fact that as humans build the world of technology, the things that they own end up owning them. The world they build is really the world that traps them and requires their maintenance. People become slaves to the civilization they build, and every person is just another cog in the machine. Only by living by nature can you really be free. If nature changes, you must too, or else be a prisoner. But this really wasn't the message of the book, or at least it's not what I took from it. Reading this felt like going back to classic literature the way it was written. And it almost felt like I was reading H.G. Wells at times. And for sure, he must have had some influence on his career. It's like a contemporary Island of Dr. Moreau, except it's written vaguely enough like the first two books I talked about earlier, and it could almost pass for a book from the 20th century. It also contains another possible unreliable first-person narrator, so we're not sure if we're looking at an alien planet, or Earth in the distant future, probably that, or something else. But by the end of the book, we should have a good idea, but once again, we deal with very small into very large world building. This book was heading in a direction and took a strange turn, I think. And I thought it was going to explore more about the evolution of things, especially since Tchaikovsky loves to include his biology background in his books, but then it kind of ended abruptly. So just try to enjoy it as you read it, and like the other books, go back for a second read once you've developed a theory about what's actually going on. If you like a fantasy novel without magic, but enough elements that contain mystique, and which is far easier to read without pause, I really do suggest reading this one. Actually, I suggest reading pretty much anything by Tchaikovsky. And so far I've yet to read a mediocre novel by him. I've read about 4 or 5. An even easier short novel, if you want to test whether or not you'll enjoy his work, is perhaps start with The Expert System's Brother. It's a quick but fulfilling read. I used to think I had to read things with at least 400 pages for enough details for a complete story, but these days I'm looking more for short novels like this one. Alright, so that about wraps it up what I read last month and some of the things I've been thinking about lately. And if you somehow got this far into the video, you're an absolute monster. And you have my deep respect. You get brownie points. And if you didn't, if you cheated your way through, well, you're more like a reasonable type and you don't have time for bullshit, in which case, I suggest perhaps Hemingway. And by the way, I had a triple deja vu while finishing the notes for this video. It was really crazy. I just heard a certain guy say an exact phrase while someone else unrelated from work was texting me about something. And both of these things happened a few months ago in the same way. And then I dreamt about it. But then the thought came out of nowhere again a few weeks later. Actually, I'm not even sure if the dream or the real event came first. It feels so weird. Anyway, this was more of a fluff video, but it's an important part of my identity. So my channel, it's not about reading Wikipedia articles with an AI voice. This is what I do. It's who I am. And everything you hear is what I say and what I write. So I'll probably end up making some short stories into my channel since there's only so much to bitch about. I mean, actually I could bitch about anything forever, but maybe this is all just for posterity eventually. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you share your own passions with those around you. Because again, if life is pointless, the best thing you can do in the meantime is distract and express yourself. So thanks again, and have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.